Welcome back for the second installment of the basic punctuation functions presentations and review to begin our distance learning during the school closure. Today, or in this video, we're going to address the 5 rules that govern most common use that people need to know. Now remember, these rules do not cover every possible use of a comma. Okay, I'm not going to talk about cities and states or math functions or, beginning a letter, dear Billy, comma. I'm going to assume that some formatting issues you either already know or can easily figure out. However, within prose, within your traditional sentences and paragraphs, there are 5 basic functions that we all really need to be able to use a comma for, okay? Now, these, sort of follow right along with the other document, the PowerPoint or PDF that was posted. And so you do want to have access to that. It wouldn't hurt to have a pen or pencil available as well. So maybe you can jot down sample sentences and things like that. And then you're going to be doing some practice with these same topics, same rules in no red ink. So let's give this a shot and share a screen here. The first thing that we want to address are our comma rules. So we need to look at all 5 of them, okay? The 5 basic ways to use commas. We need commas after introductory words, phrases, and clauses. So when we start a sentence in a certain way, we will need a comma as we transition into the main idea. Rule 2. Rule 2 is the hardest one. Of all of the rules that you're going to hear in these presentations, this is the most complicated one because it's actually several different comma rules all sort of mashed together. As I mentioned in the introductory video, I originally, when I first started teaching, was using something around 24 comma rules. And it took me several years to refine and whittle things down and figure out what students really needed to know, to look at what actually appears on SOLs and on SATs. And what I figured out was that we could get down to a small number by, in certain cases, eliminating duplicates, and in some cases, combining similar functions. Rule 2 is a tricky one, so we want to be careful when we get there, but the basic idea is if you interrupt the main flow of a sentence, that's not a real grammar term, but if you interrupt the flow of a sentence to add optional or non-essential information, we need to put commas on both sides. So if something feels like it's interrupted into the middle of a sentence, you sort of cover it up with your hand and you say, well, if I cover this up, does the sentence mean the same thing without it? Is it still complete and grammatically correct? If that interruption doesn't need to be there for the sentence to still be complete and mean basically the same thing with just less detail, and it sounds or feels as though it was interrupted or forced into place, we put a comma on both sides. Now, again, there's a lot of different details that go into that. I'm not going to get into all of them. Some of this we just have to feel out. And this is where, if we're being honest, people who read more do have a little natural advantage here, because in some cases you're just going to see it and you're going to know it because you've read so many sentences where you've seen the punctuation in place. It's going to be easy to figure out from that. So reading can help your writing, and this is a good example of that. Rule 3 is the easiest one. Rule 3 is when we're dealing with lists of 3 or more. So if you list 3 or more items, put commas between all of them. That's the easiest one. You've been doing that forever. Rule number 4, you put commas between multiple modifiers. When you have multiple adjectives describing the same noun or pronoun, you will put, usually, not always, you'll usually put commas between those modifiers. This can sometimes be done with adverbs as well, but that's less common. But the same basic rule and checks on it are going to apply. And then the 5th rule is going to be putting a comma with a coordinating conjunction with the fanboys when we're connecting related independent clauses. So each half needs to be a complete sentence, or could be a complete sentence. And if they're being attached with for, in, nor, but, or, yet, so, then we need a comma with that conjunction. If one side or the other wouldn't be complete, then we leave the comma out. That's the basic run through. So let's take a look at at rule 1. Oops. All right. So rule 1 is where we need to think about introductory pieces. The basic idea here is that if you have a sentence that begins with a preposition, with a subordinating conjunction, or usually if it begins with an adverb, you'll have a comma as you transition into the main idea of that sentence. Consider a way to sort of simplify this is if you tell your reader where, when, or how the sentence is occurring, where, when, or how the main action is going to take place. Before you get to what is really going on, we need a comma at the transition point. So if you look at the first sample sentence, today we will learn about commas. Well, I told you when before I told you what. Another nice way to check this is to take the piece that you think would be the beginning, would be that introduction, and move it to the end of the clause. Move it to the end of that part of the sentence, that subject-verb combination. It should still usually make sense there. And usually if you move it to the end, it wouldn't require punctuation. So we could say, we will learn about commas today. That's perfectly fine. It makes sense. It means the same thing, and we don't need to punctuate it at the end. It's when we move that where, when, or how, we move that extra contextual information back to the beginning of the sentence, we need a comma in transition. Number two, or sample two, after this class, you will understand punctuation. It's classic where you start with a prepositional phrase. I have a short phrase telling you where, when, or how, so I need a comma at the transition point. I could just as easily say, you'll understand punctuation after this class. That would be fine. It would still be accurate and complete, and I wouldn't need a comma if I move it to the end. It's when I move that information back to the beginning. Okay, and same all the way down. The final sample at the bottom would require a little rephrasing. If we moved it, say, it is important, while punctuation can be boring, we'd have to alter it and say, punctuation is important, though it can be boring, something like that. Here, we're starting with what's called a dependent clause. We do have a subject and a verb, but that beginning piece, while punctuation can be boring, it can't stand alone. And so when we're starting with that extra context, we got to make sure we put a comma as we transition into the main idea. Okay, that's rule one. Rule two, remember, this is the one we got to be the most careful about. We're talking about commas around interruptions. Now, commas around interruptions, this is tricky, so you have to figure out where you see an interruption in the flow of that sentence. Okay, so take a look at the first sample. Your English teacher, Mr. Tibbens, will teach you well. Your English teacher will teach you well. So I have something that felt like it was an interruption, and I now am pretty sure that is non-essential. I can remove it from the sentence, and the sentence is still complete. It means the same thing. I'm just lacking a little bit of detail. Your English teacher will teach you well. I'm interrupting to clarify. In this case, we're working with what's called an appositive phrase, where you essentially rename the subject or the noun or pronoun that came just before it. The second sample, do you, Susie, understand punctuation? This is direct address. I'm directly addressing someone, and I interrupt myself to clarify who I'm talking to. So imagine I'm looking at three people, and I say, do you understand punctuation? They might not be clear. Is this for all of us? Is this one of us? If I interrupt to clarify, do you, Susie, understand punctuation? Well, now I've been more precise. That kind of interruption for direct address still requires a comma on both sides, because we can remove Susie's name and the sentence is still complete and means basically the same thing. The third sample has a descriptive phrase. It's still basically a longer appositive. The fourth sample actually has what we would call a dependent clause in the middle. I'm saying English is tough. I interrupt, which happens to be my favorite class. I'm interrupting to clarify something about English. Now, that's a lot more information, but it's not essential to the sentence. What is the sentence about? English is tough. The fact that it's my favorite class is extra optional information that was forced into the middle. So there I need commas on both sides. The last sample just demonstrates that sometimes an interruption can come at the end of the sentence as well. Juan loves his English class. That's the sentence. That's what it's about. Except for grammar work, that doesn't need to be there, right? He's saying, oh, there's one thing about it doesn't love. He still loves his English class. That's the thing that's important here. That's the main idea of the sentence. The limiting sort of factor here is that I've interrupted at the end. I still don't really need the information, so I set it off with a comma. But as I get to the end, and I put a period instead of another comma. Those are the basic ways to do this. You want to be very careful with the interruption rule. This is one of the trickiest ones because it's 4 or 5 different comma functions all rolled into one. But first, does it feel like it's an interruption? Does it interrupt the flow? If so, I start thinking maybe I need the commas. Then I double check, could I remove that information from the sentence and still have it complete? I literally, if I'm proofreading or editing and I look and I say, I'm not sure what to do here, I will literally cover up that word and I read it without it. I say, okay, that still means the same thing. I put my hand away. Does it feel like the interruption? Okay. So this is a good time to double check by actually trying to remove those words from the sentence to figure out if it's essential or non-essential. Okay, and some people will use the phrase restrictive. I think it's restrictive and non-restrictive or unrestrictive. Same basic idea. Rule three. Rule three is the easy one. If you have 3 or more items in a list, you put commas between all the items in a list. That last comma, the comma before the last item in a series of 3 or more, is referred to as the Oxford comma. At the beginning of this hyperdoc, one of the first sort of opening intro, things that are supposed to grab a little interest, there's an optional article linked from, I don't remember the source, maybe CNN, something like that, that referred to a rather serious court decision a few years ago where it was a civil suit between, I think it was a union and a dairy manufacturer or something like that. And essentially they were looking at the language of a clause in the contract. And the judge ruled that because the comma was missing, the sentence meant something different than what the company had actually intended. Now, we can argue whether that's reasonable or not. That's a separate issue. But for our purposes, how about this? If you see 3 or more items in a list, you just put commas between all of them always. So if I have 1, 2, 3 items in the list, I have 2 commas. If I have 4 items in the list, I need 3 commas. If I have 5 items in the list, I'll have 4 commas. I put commas between all the items in the list so that my reader never has to guess how many things I was actually talking about. Take a look at the second sample. Peanut butter and jelly, turkey, and ham and cheese are my favorite sandwiches. It's perfectly clear I'm talking about 3 different sandwiches. Now imagine for a moment that you left out the Oxford comma, the one before the final item. It would say peanut butter and jelly, turkey and ham and cheese are my favorite sandwiches. I have no idea whether it's, peanut butter and jelly is one. Is turkey another sandwich, or is it turkey and ham, or turkey and ham and cheese? I could have anywhere from 2 to 4 sandwiches here. It's not clear because of the extra ands, and the structure of the list itself. If I always put commas between all the items in a list of 3 or more, I'm always right. My reader's never confused. You use the Oxford comma always, just so that you can be consistent. You don't have to worry about it. Okay. Rule 3 is the easy one. Commas go between items in a list of 3 or more. Number 4. Number 4 is not terribly tricky, but you may need to do a little work where you double check yourself, basically. What you want to do is identify situations when you have multiple adjectives or sometimes adverbs all describing the same thing. So your first sample sentence, your muddled, confused punctuation will soon improve. Okay, great. What I'm really doing with these commas is replacing an unnecessary and. So when I'm trying to decide, do I need a comma? Do I not need it? What do I do here? Could I say and? Your muddled and confused punctuation will soon improve. Your muddled and confused punctuation. Yeah, that works fine. So I get rid of the unnecessary and, I put a comma in place. Perfect. Your muddled, confused punctuation will soon improve. The and trick is the best way to go about this. Some students who maybe have done some SAT prep work, or if you've taken SAT prep classes, sometimes people will recommend another rule that can be helpful. I don't love it, and I'll tell you in a moment, but one of the things that they'll tell you in some of those SAT prep classes is that first, use the and rule. Could I say and? Then the second thing is you should be able to reverse the order. So I could say your confused, muddled punctuation. In that case, that's fine. That makes perfect sense. I can put the comma in. One of the things to be careful of, though, is that sometimes you say, well, I can't reverse the order, so I should leave out the comma. There is a natural order to modifiers and descriptors in the English language. This is something, if you look it up, there's a great visual of this somebody put online a year or two ago that floats around once in a while, where it basically says how you talk about location, size, color, number, blah, 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 all in a certain order, that there's a hierarchy to it, that if you're a native English speaker, you never really have to learn. You just do it because that's how you've heard people speak. But if you're learning English as a second language, or as just an additional language, you will sometimes use the words out of order, and it'll sound funny to a native speaker. So I don't like doing the rule where you can flip them, just because in certain cases you'll say, well, I flip it means the same thing, but it doesn't sound right. And when it doesn't sound right, you start thinking I leave the comma out. Don't make it harder than it's got to be. Okay. Look at the third sample. That tall, smart woman punctuates well. That tall and smart woman punctuates well. Perfect. We're good. We leave it alone. Now go back to the second sample. you're going to see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4 adjectives all describing the teacher. Really 5 if you throw in great. But so your intelligent, handsome, humble English teacher is great. Stop it. Oh, you make me blush. All right. That joke works better with a live audience. Now, your intelligent, handsome, humble English teacher is great. Notice that there are commas between intelligent and handsome, between handsome and humble, but not between humble and English. Use the and rule. Your intelligent and handsome and humble English teacher is great. If we put a comma between humble and English, then I would put another and in. And then the sentence would read this way. Your intelligent and handsome and humble and English teacher is great. That changes the function of the word English. That would mean that I, or your English teacher, it would mean that we're British. But that's not what you're trying to say. You're trying to say that the person who's teaching your English class happens to be intelligent, handsome, and humble. So the adjective English is actually doing a different job than the other adjectives. Unless you're going to be an editor or an English professor, you don't really need to know how to identify the difference or name it. It doesn't matter. All you need to know is they're doing different jobs, and I can identify it by asking myself, could I say and between these modifiers, and would it change the meaning? And so in that case, we do your intelligent, comma, handsome, comma, humble English teacher is great, because if I put commas anywhere else, I've changed the meaning of the sentence. Rule 4 isn't really that tricky. For most people, in most cases, it's pretty straightforward. You just want to be careful and remember that when you're not sure, think about, could I say and? That's rule 4. And then rule 5. Rule 5 is one of the ones you've been drilled on the most. Okay, most students have been learning rules 3 and 5 since somewhere in elementary school. Yeah, for this one, you just need to memorize the fanboys, okay? For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Memorize it. Those are all the coordinating conjunctions in the English language. Coordinating conjunctions essentially make two things grammatically equal within a sentence. Doesn't mean that they're actually equal in real life. I love ice cream and world peace. I'm not saying that ice cream and world peace are of the same significance. I'm saying that in that sentence, they're doing basically the same job, or they have the same sort of strength. So we need to know these. The other nice thing about learning the list of fanboys is that if you see a conjunction that's not one of these, it's almost certainly going to be a subordinating conjunction. Subordinating conjunctions are words like because or as or since or if or though. Those get punctuated differently, and what they end up doing is introducing a new idea, a new phrase, a new clause that is somehow weaker grammatically. It's weaker than the piece it was being attached to. So that gets us into clauses and some more complicated information that we can deal with another time. For now, memorize the list. Fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So I say punctuation is important, but it's only one part of writing. Another thing, and I do this all the time, and some of you have seen me do this in class, I will literally cover each half of the sentence. So I will say, punctuation is important, but it's only one part of writing. Okay, punctuation is important. That could be its own complete sentence. That's an independent clause. And I look at the other side. It's only one part of writing. It is only one part of writing. That's an independent clause. That could be its own sentence. So then I'd say, well, how did I attach them? Cover the piece in the middle. Is it for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so? If it is, I need a comma before that word. If it's not, if it's the word as or since or if or because or one of those words, I would not punctuate it. Punctuation is important, but it's only one part of writing. I have two independent clauses combined by the fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So I throw in the comma. Okay, works the same way the whole way down the page, including the last sample, where you have you can work hard or you can slack off, but no one will do the work for you. Here I have 3 clauses, but each one could be its own complete sentence. You can work hard. You can slack off. No one will do the work for you. I have 3 clauses, 3 pieces that are their own functioning unit. Then I say, did I attach it with for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so? In this case, yeah, for both of them. So commas go in both places. If I use the different conjunction to make the attachment, I do not want a comma. Okay, I might need a semicolon, I might need nothing, but if it's not for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, I don't want to touch the commas. Okay, that's it. Those are the 5 ways you need to know to use commas in your writing to be able to punctuate better than 90-95% of the people in the world. These are the only comma functions that regularly appear on SOLs or SAT tests, with the occasional exception of addressing a letter or city and state or something like that. At which point, be careful on the formatting. And if you have questions about those issues, make sure you email your teacher. That's all we have for the introduction to the basic functions of commas. Now you want to go ahead and log in to LCPS Go, click on the no red ink icon, and look for the comma practice that is available to you there. Again, if you have questions or need help, don't hesitate to send an email to your teacher. Thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed this thrilling review.